My lords, ladies, and gentlemen, as in the tradition of the theater, I refer you to your printed program and inform you that at this performance, the role of Professor James Mirage will be played by Professor Ian MacDonald, and I'm happy to be here. And may I say what a great pleasure it is for my wife Dorothy and for me, not only to be your guests in the University of Hull, but indeed to play a formal role in these magnificent proceedings this evening. The university of which I am President and Vice-Chancellor Emeritus, York University in Toronto, derives not only its name, of course, but indeed its emblem from County York, and I have no doubt that we have also benefited from the friendliness and good cheer characteristic of this part of Britain, notwithstanding what the formal county boundaries may be at any point in time. But I'm here today, as you have heard from your Chancellor, as Chairman, indeed the newly elected Chairman of the Board of Governors of the Commonwealth of Learning, the Commonwealth's Distance Learning Institution, and to preside at the first Commonwealth Open Lecture established by the Commonwealth of Learning in honor of our first chairman, Lord Briggs. I think you'll be interested to know that this lectureship will be given annually in a different place each year within the Commonwealth. But today there is no place more appropriate for the inaugural lecture than the University of Hull, and no one more appropriate to deliver it than your Vice-Chancellor, David Dilks. Perhaps there is a Hull equivalent of the expression carrying coals to Newcastle. If not, then I'm surely creating one by introducing the Vice-Chancellor to an audience in his own university. I am indeed reminded of the introduction of a well-known Canadian constitutional authority who our High Commissioner will recall, the late Senator Eugene Forsey. Now, Senator Forsey was a prominent socialist, and he was being introduced at a dinner by a staunch conservative premier of the province of Prince Edward Island, a tall, lean, spare farmer of few words. And the introduction went something like this. Here's Forsey. Don't know much about him, but here he is. At the end of Forsey's presentation, the Premier was called upon in turn to thank him for his remarks. And he rose to his full height and he said, when I introduced him, I said I didn't know much about him. He said, I know plenty now. Well, I have no doubt you know plenty about your Vice-Chancellor and indeed his distinguished university career. But you may not all be as familiar with his significant contribution to the affairs of the Commonwealth. And believe me, there is plenty to know. Long before the establishment of the Commonwealth of Learning, David Dilks was working for the fulfillment of the important goals of the Commonwealth, an interest which he has, I know, consistently maintained since his school days and carried on as a volunteer in countless ways. In the 1950s, he was a member of the Commonwealth Youth Movement and, indeed, happy to note, met his wife Jill in that connection, and both were extensively involved in taking part in organizing exchanges of young people in the Commonwealth. This has remained a continuous effort on his part outside of his academic career throughout his working life. In 1968, he founded the Commonwealth Youth Exchange Council in London to fund and to organize non-academic exchanges of young people. This was the result, as you can imagine, and as many of us would know, of years of negotiation, persuasion, and money-raising. And CYEC brought together government, voluntary organizations, local education authorities, and individuals to work together for the first time. From 1970, it attracted the first official government funding for youth exchanges, and that has carried on through the CYEC until the present time, 25 years later. He also worked extensively as a consultant in the Commonwealth Secretariat for our own Commonwealth of Learning president, Dr. James Mirage, and my good friend, the late Arnold Smith, the first Secretary General of the Commonwealth. As a university teacher and administrator, he's been concerned all his working life with overseas students and scholarships, and as a trustee of the Lennox Boyd Trust and the Edward Boyle Memorial Trust. But I think it's also particularly appropriate to recognize that Jill might equally share the platform today in terms of her role in what is called the Commonwealth Linking Trust, over which she has presided, and which links schools throughout the Commonwealth and has done so since 1971. The Trust organized the program of teacher exchanges within the Commonwealth, funded by the Commonwealth Foundation from 1985 to 1988. And so it is that there have been countless young people whose lives have been much affected by contacts made through CYEC, CLT, and university scholarships. And as they go about their lives and their interests and their activities, unknowingly will have been touched by David Dilks' patient and unsung work. But for those of us involved in Commonwealth affairs, we know of that work, we value it, and we acknowledge it today by inviting David Dilks to deliver the first Commonwealth Open Lecture in honor of our founding chairman, Asa Briggs.
Well, as Mr. Adlai Stevenson is reported to have said after a somewhat similar introduction, after that I can't wait to hear what I'm going to say. And I should be graceless if I didn't depart instantly from the script and say to you, Dr. MacDonald, that I couldn't easily hear, unmoved, what you just said, not only about me, for which I could hardly thank you sufficiently, but where I make a discount for friendship, but also about my wife. When you spoke about the CYEC, which was not the happiest and most peaceful of experiences, at least in all its phases, you made me think of something that I've sometimes said in public but long ago, and take this opportunity to repeat because he chances to be here. How deeply the CYEC and all the causes you just described are indebted to Michael Hellier, who was its first treasurer, its indefatigable supporter, and who is here tonight as the Academic Relations Officer of Canada House. Now to the more formal part. Professor MacDonald and my Lord and Chancellor, Chancellor-elect Lord Briggs, Pro-Chancellors, Your Excellencies, my Lord Mayor, members of the university. We often use on our degree days like this evening's words which redouble their force on this occasion. Welcome, we say, to our Commonwealth of Learning. It is an expression which Charles Morris, formerly Vice-Chancellor of the University of Leeds, favoured. And those words were perhaps in the mind of Lord Briggs when, as chairman of a group which reported in 1987, he, with his colleagues, entitled Towards a Commonwealth of Learning, their proposal to create what was then called the University of the Commonwealth for Cooperation in Distance Education. And the phrase Commonwealth of Learning is one which suits our university world. It reminds us that our first duty is to knowledge, and by no means only to that knowledge which is said to be immediately useful. The word Commonwealth, meaning a shared possession, something of richness and value, to be sustained by effort, expresses another part of our purpose. Hence the motto of this university, Lampada Ferens, bearing the torch, passing the flame of learning from the hand of one generation to that of the next. Had this evening's proceedings consisted only of the admission to that Commonwealth of Lord Armstrong and Lord Briggs, who has been Chancellor of the Open University for 16 years, and whose tenure in that office will, I hope, be matched by Lord Armstrong's with us, this would have been an ever memorable occasion in its own right. But the other Commonwealth of Learning, the one with the capital letters that spreads its beneficent influence in many directions from Vancouver, pays the university tonight a compliment which I hasten to acknowledge. That Dr. MacDonald, Lord Briggs' successor, should come from Canada to preside redoubles our sense of obligation, and his connection of York University, of which he was just speaking, tells us of the intimate contacts between this part of England and Canada. For York University normally means to us a place only 40 miles away, but the one which he adorns reminds us that the original name of Toronto was York, and not far from that York, we find the names of places also dear to us: Whitby, Scarborough, Pickering. In Canada, every politician's constituency is called a riding, a term which occasions a good deal of puzzlement in Canada, but which it requires visitors from Yorkshire to explain with the full force of the term. And a couple of 100 miles away from the old York, the new Toronto, we find the city of Hull, lying immediately opposite Ottawa, but on the Quebec shore of the river. In the present year, we have in this university students from 35 Commonwealth countries. Shall I surprise you if I say that the vast majority of our students in this university come from the Commonwealth? I shall only surprise you, of course, if you forget, as we do from time to time, that Britain is a member of the Commonwealth herself. At any given moment, in addition to those who are here, we are teaching about 1,200 students from overseas, people who do not come to Hull from their courses, but to whom we export the staff in places ranging from Harare to Lahore, Kuala Lumpur to Singapore, Hong Kong to Sydney. I need hardly add that our students and visitors come and go to all parts of Europe, the Americas, the Caribbean, Africa, just as merchants and adventurers and traders have gone from this great port over many centuries. Was it not from Hull itself that Robinson Crusoe set sail on September the 1st, 1651? The Pilgrim Fathers began from a place near here their storm-beaten voyage to found a colony in the New World. Captain Cook sailed these coasts 150 years later, before he surveyed the St. Lawrence and Newfoundland and charted the waters of New Zealand, Australia, New Guinea, Java, even the Cape of Good Hope. No more than a few generations ago, the rest of the world was mysterious, remote, threatening. Information about it traveled but slowly and fitfully. And so great is the transformation of our affairs wrought by the techniques of modern communication that we now expect to transmit news and images in moments from one end of the world to the other. Nation can speak peace or war to nation across the continents. We sit here on the campus of this university and discuss matters, thanks to video conferencing, as it were across the table with colleagues in Vancouver or New Delhi or Sydney. And these themes, the nature of the Commonwealth, and especially that part of it which concerns learning, the prospect of making something of these opportunities that opened up to us by the revolution in communications. Those are the themes which I wish to broach tonight. I need hardly add with what a sense of honor I deliver this lecture to mark the services to the Commonwealth of Learning and to many wider causes of Lord Briggs, whose friendships span the world, whose interests are innumerable, whose sympathies inexhaustible, whose energy is irrepressible, and whose generosity is a legend. My purpose is also to do what a university ought to do, to speak about the little mentioned or noticed, about subjects which are neglected. To be critical, not for the sake of casting stones or scoring points, but because universities must test from one generation to another ideas which may once have been accepted but are no longer in full vigor, or which may be derided by fashion, but worthy of a kinder fate. You will notice in the next half an hour a certain concentration upon Britain's role, former, present, and potential in the Commonwealth, which will seem, I hope, appropriate when we remember what Dr. MacDonald has just been explaining, that these lectures will from year to year be held in different Commonwealth countries, where the emphasis will properly be otherwise. Next year, we understand, in Canada, and in 1996 in India. In seeking to make a theme so vast, manageable in the compass of the time, I hope you will pardon me for not dwelling too lengthily on the work of the official Commonwealth, which does not in the least mean that the work of the official agencies is not of the first importance. The monitoring of elections, the efforts much increased in their force in recent years of the Commonwealth Secretariat and of individual Commonwealth governments to maintain or introduce democracy and decent standards of public life. The perpetual warfare against drug trafficking and abuse, efforts to help the pitiful tides of refugees, all the complexities of heavy indebtedness and falling prices for primary commodities in the Third World, the injustices of the terms upon which many of those countries have to trade. Those are areas, and by no means the only one, in which the official Commonwealth plays a substantial role. Its programs are effective. They are, by international standards, economical, if that's a word I may be permitted in the presence of the Chancellor-elect, very much more so than those, for instance, of the World Bank or the World Health Organization. But in broad terms, those activities are in their nature the preserve of Commonwealth governments or of the Secretariat in London. And it is part of my thesis tonight that the Commonwealth must be far more than an association of governments if it is to do for the world as much as it should. Here on the screen you see examples of some of the practical, direct, and useful activities, not always appreciated in full at the time, as you observe, but all for the greater good. It is not, you understand, a federation, but an association which is, for better or its worse, in its nature, different from the European Union or from those regional groupings which rely on the proximity of the members to each other. Here we see the contrasts, the many tiny islands and the broad blocks of territory. Canada to the extreme left, the second largest country by land area in the world. Australia, scarcely inferior in size. The broad tracts of sub-Saharan Africa, the mass of the Indian subcontinent. Now these 50 states, which we see on the screen, cover a quarter of the habitable surface of the globe and have about a quarter of its population, some 1.4 billion, out of a worldwide total of about 5.5. And that figure, incidentally, has doubled, or more than doubled, since 1950. And even on the lowest estimates, the 5.5 billion will have risen by another half to something like 8 billion by the middle of the next century. And in that same span of less than 2 generations which separates us from 1950, the food production of the world has risen in total, but it has gone down in relation to the heads of population. Here we see the distribution of the Commonwealth's territories and labor. A big swath in Africa and the Indian Ocean, a substantial one in the Caribbean and the Atlantic. Asia, the Pacific, the Mediterranean, the 1% is made up for in the beauty of the territories, that is to say Malta and Cyprus, that is compensation for the modest proportion of the total. Now, Britain is sometimes described as lying at the junction of Europe's weather systems. Here, the fronts and currents and eddies and tides contend for mastery. Did not Robinson Crusoe himself find that the ship was no sooner got out of the Humber than the wind began to blow and the sea to rise in a most frightful manner? To a considerable degree, we still stand at the junction of many of the world's international alignments. This is one of the points at which Europe, the special relationship with the United States, NATO, the Western European Union, the Commonwealth, come into play and cross. Indeed, there is no other power with the same set of connections, though that isn't to deny that we are less strong relatively than we were a generation ago. Without any desire to be contentious, especially on an occasion of this sort, let me say that I think it no less than tragic to see the notion almost unconsciously accepted that to be pro-Europe somehow implies a hostility or indifference to the Commonwealth, or conversely, that a profound interest in the Commonwealth precludes a serious interest in Europe, or even in the more advanced forms of European unity. This supposed division, the alleged impossibility of spanning those two broad sets of relationships, has been a commonplace of British politics for many years, and one which, to my mind, has done us nothing but harm. To put it at the least, the Commonwealth represents here an enormous investment of talent over many generations. Yet it has faded from our consciousness with astonishing speed in the last generation or two. It plays no part in our general elections, and little part, or so it seems, in our daily life. No doubt it is true that the trading patterns were bound to diminish, the investments to alter, the military needs to change. But we've had nothing sufficiently solid to put in their place. And I need hardly argue the case that if we will say little about the Commonwealth in our newspapers or television coverage, except in case of disaster, if we will not place Commonwealth subjects in our national curriculum, if we will not make sure that the rising generations understand something of the nature of the association, then we must expect the inevitable result. The point may as well be put bluntly. Prolonged attacks upon the British Empire and its later phases as little more than an organized system of exploitation and robbery, and the confrontations over some 30 years on account of South Africa and Rhodesia have done measureless harm. The Commonwealth has been a political liability for every British Prime Minister at some phase or other of his or her tenure for 30 years. Now, you may well retort, our backs should have been broader. Perhaps so. But it is the fact that to be accused of such a degree of sinfulness by representatives of countries whose own regimes would not always bear, how shall I express it tactfully, would not always bear the most rigorous scrutiny, has created tensions in this country which only the hardiest enthusiasts for the Commonwealth have been prepared to endure. The news and hopeful situation in South Africa, to which the individual Commonwealth governments and the Secretariat have contributed so notably over so long a period. And with a little luck, that country's rejoining of the Commonwealth, so that what we were looking at on the screen just now may have an extension right to the Cape, ought to help greatly. And at long last, if the poison is being drained from that ulcer, we may have the opportunity to concentrate upon something more positive. Nor is it only a question of relations between governments. The Commonwealth is often wrongly equated with governments, whereas most of its most valuable activity is carried on in other circles. And properly regarded, at any rate for us in Britain, the Commonwealth offers wonderful opportunities for travel, to study the literature and the cultures, the geography, the politics, the geopolitics, the history of half the world. For it isn't possible to take a serious interest in Commonwealth affairs without relating to South America, the United States, the powers of Central Asia, most parts of the Far East, almost every part of Africa. We're constantly told from the overseas Commonwealth that a renewal of British interest and faith is earnestly desired. Many of those who lament our indifference and wonder at it, often in genuine bewilderment, ought to ask themselves now whether they cannot act in a way and speak in a way which makes that renewal a practical possibility. All this, as you see, leads to the question, why does Britain matter in this context? The answer is partly because of the junction of the international forces, partly because we are still, in terms of output, easily the strongest of the four major industrialized Commonwealth countries, partly because we retain the strongest Commonwealth infrastructure. Now, if others, shall we say, Canada, India, Australia, were there to pick up the torch and reinterpret the message, to find better and new ways of revitalizing the Commonwealth, that would be another matter. But of that, there is little sign. And insofar as this country is concerned, we do not see a careful judgment made upon a measured examination of the facts that the Commonwealth has nothing left to offer. Rather, it is a question of newer fashions, a sense of guilt, often an attitude of a somewhat careless neutrality, or among people who feel more warmly towards the Commonwealth than that, a fluid goodwill. The philosopher and statesman Edmund Burke remarks that public life is a situation of power and energy. He trespasses against his duty who sleeps upon his watch, as well as he that goes over to the enemy. Very well. It is part of our duty to judge whether in our generation we are trespassing against our duty, or merely watching the genteel decline of an association which had its uses years ago. If the Commonwealth fades away in a haze of neglect or nostalgia, or becomes an association known to and valued by only a handful of people, ought we to care? Let us address first and openly the weaknesses, the distances, the cost of travel, poverty, illiteracy, disease, the imbalance in an association of 50 states where only 4 are counted as industrialized, although that does not embrace Malaysia and Singapore, for example. What my distinguished predecessor and devoted Commonwealth servant all his life, Sir Roy Marshall, calls the excess of dependency. Too poor a balance between those who have the resources and those who are desperate for them. A membership about half of which consists of small islands, populations of no more than 10,000 apiece in Nauru or Tuvalu, of 85,000 in Dominica, of about 250,000 in Barbados and Brunei, to take 2 widely different examples. That is about the same population as that of the city of Hull. And all that standing by contrast with 870 millions in India, which, if present trends continue, will have a population as great as that of China by the year 2010 or 2020. The collapse of the Russian Empire means, although I suppose this is a harsh thing to say, that there is far less of an incentive nowadays for the richer countries to purchase the goodwill, or to nod and wink at abuses, or to endure abuse themselves than there was a few years ago. We are not so well endowed in the Commonwealth with the towering figures of old. Let us think of Mr. Nehru or Sir Robert Menzies, or Mr. Lester Pearson or Field Marshal Smuts. There is a seeming lack of inspiring and original enterprises upon which the Commonwealth is engaged. You will say, is that a full, perfect, and sufficient litany of weaknesses? Maybe. But if we turn to the strengths, we find that between 1/3 and 1/4 of the whole membership of the United Nations consists of member states of the Commonwealth. We notice the high respect in which many Commonwealth enterprises and institutions are held. The spanning by our association, so graphically illustrated a moment or two ago just there, of the continents, whose interlocking fortunes ought to be more obvious to us in these days of instantaneous communication, even if, rather perversely, we concentrate now upon regional associations. the network of contacts and the reservoirs of goodwill, especially amongst the older generation. When we speak of communications, we think first of the telephone, television, radio, air travel. Until quite recent times, the control of such communications lay within the hands of governments, at least if they so determined. Travel could be strictly controlled. Radio broadcasts and television and telephone communication could be and were cut off. The coming of the new techniques, and especially of the satellites, has changed all that. There's no question that every culture in places, no matter how remote, is directly affected. We need think only of the part which such communications played in the collapse of the Russian Empire. But we need also to think of communications in wider and subtler senses. What is the effect upon us of shared language? How much of our cultural and outlook is determined through processes of which we are scarcely conscious by the literature of our own country and of others, and by the language which we use? Earlier this year, the Indian and Chinese students preparing for the degree of Master of Business Administration in this university held a dinner. One of them, already occupying a senior position in India, described to us how he felt immediately at home in this country when he came here for the first time at the age of 40. When he asked himself how this could be, he discovered it was because he'd been brought up to speak English from his early childhood, and even more because he was familiar with much of English literature. And thus, he said, I found myself, to my surprise and delight, not a stranger in a foreign country, even though it was at the opposite end of the world from my own, but at ease and curious to see with my eyes what I had imagined so often with my mind. In short, today's communications provide us with opportunities of self-knowledge on a scale which would have been out of the question even a generation ago. If we wish to make a claim for what Dr. MacDonald, you were just calling the unsung activities of the Commonwealth, we might say that its principal characteristic, especially at those meetings which deal with functions rather than politics, is that the people in the room often know each other well, they want to get on, and they generally do. They've come there to try to make something happen. We talk about our common heritage and the fact that uniquely in an association of such a size, we do not need any interpreters. Which is not to say that we do not need to interpret to each other in ways beyond the formalities of language, our different histories, situations, and hopes. The common heritage is indeed of supreme importance, because it provides at least a minimum level without which such intimacy and collaboration are impossible. But what matters far more for our fragmented, not to say tormented, world, is the mixture of common inheritance and diversity. It is the mark of the civilized man or woman to take other people's cultures and languages seriously. That does not mean that we have to be dismissive or disdainful about our own. And it is also the mark of a good university to inculcate those habits of mind in the young. Academic life, broadly defined, is the main strand of our former associations, in which the Commonwealth connections are still powerful. That is not true to the same degree among the trading associations, or among the military, or among the politicians. But in the world of universities, the commitment and enthusiasm are all visible. And of course, when I say the world of universities, I do not mean only the old universities like this, but the very new kind of university which the Commonwealth of Learning itself constitutes. By commitment, I mean a willingness to make some sacrifices. Whether it will be so in 10 or 20 years' time is another matter. Joint degrees, grants for conferences, funds for departmental links, shared research, they're all of them splendid. Every one of those activities is declared to be indispensable for the new Europe. Every one is generously funded from Brussels. Every one is just as desirable or more in the Commonwealth connection. The intelligent young everywhere are seeking eagerly an international dimension to their education. Sometimes that can be achieved in the time-honored fashion of going abroad for a course of a year or 3 years. but for most that is out of reach. And the fresh techniques of distance learning, learning off the screen, off the page, off the air. If only we will learn how to seize the chance and direct it. Open splendid new opportunities within the Commonwealth of all associations, because one language, one text, and one program can be widely used or quickly adapted. I never met a European colleague in politics, business, or academic life who would not give his eyes to have the range of contacts and the ease of entry all over the world which we take for granted. Nor have I ever met one who could understand why we do not make more of that priceless asset. In too many of our Commonwealth affairs, we resign ourselves with a sigh to the repeated statement, "I'm afraid there aren't any resources for this." If that makes us sharp and effective, so much the better, but it's often no more than a recipe for ineffectiveness. In many of our Commonwealth affairs, we almost expect to be treated as the poor relations, and as long as we behave thus, I fear we shall be so treated. Of all Commonwealth students pursuing a course abroad, over a half are in one country. Well, you will say with some relief, at last some cheerful news. It must be Britain. But it is not. The country is the United States. Less than a third of all Commonwealth students taking courses outside their own countries are going to another Commonwealth country. The worldwide total of students going abroad for some part of their education is presently about 1,200,000. Of those, only 15% study in any Commonwealth country. Well over a third of the whole international total is in the United States, and 30% is in the European Union. It is true that Commonwealth student mobility has picked up somewhat in the last 5 years, and that is by itself a cause for rejoicing. But 60% of the entire Commonwealth total comes from 3 places, each of them small: Hong Kong, Malaysia, and Singapore. I should not dare dwell in the presence of Sir Roy Marshall, the greatest living expert on the subject, on the question of fees, an issue which has caused him and his colleagues in the group on student mobility many hours of anguish for the last dozen years and more. Perhaps it suffices to say for tonight that the fees are so pitched that without very substantial help from scholarships, there are few who can come here, or I may add, to most of the other industrialized countries of the Commonwealth, except from the richer countries. Time and again, the consequences of such a policy have been pointed out. The heads of the Commonwealth governments themselves have said the same thing, that without a real stimulus to the mobility of students, the ablest, the most outgoing, the most lively people of their generation, future relationships within our association will be impaired. When the House of Lords debated Commonwealth affairs a few evenings ago, the Chancellor-elect of this university pointed out that this is a state of affairs which we must change. We need also to think outside conventional boundaries. We ought to try to bring more of our Commonwealth students into direct contact with the European Union and with Central and Eastern Europe. There is room to adapt most of the present schemes of Commonwealth and European unity in that sense, so that students, by a series of linkages between our universities in this country and other European universities, will have the additional opportunity to attend a course in mainland Europe. And one footnote, so that it doesn't all sound simply like a plea that somebody else shall do something. It is plain that if universities and senates mean what they say about the damage done to their international connections and long-standing friendships by the rapid increase of fees in recent years, they must demonstrate that they're doing all they can from their own resources, as we're trying to do in Hull, before they can expect ministers, civil servants, the businesses, and the charities to respond. Now, if it is true that these connections all over the world are both valuable and at risk, if the Commonwealth nexus opens, as I firmly believe it does, magic casements onto the wider world, do we have the means of making more people aware of these opportunities so that they can at least test such assertions from their own knowledge and experience? Do we have a way of making the currents of opinion and conviction in Commonwealth countries run more strongly? In other words, Can we do anything of substance other than wait for action by ministers and officials? Here, without any claim that they're exclusive or specially original, are some suggestions in shorthand. First, education about the nature of the Commonwealth itself, especially in schools. We need to have well-written, readily accessible guides showing how the Commonwealth can be brought into the study of geography, history, politics, literature, environmental studies. Television. The astonishing range of useful and often noble activities in which the Commonwealth agencies indulge, sometimes official, sometimes private, is hardly known even among the experts. Is it really beyond possibility that several of the big broadcasting corporations of the Commonwealth could be persuaded to collaborate to make a series worthy of the theme? Contacts and exchanges between the professions, especially that of the school teachers, the worst provided for of all the professions. But if we say to ourselves that the Commonwealth badly needs the attention of the intelligent young, we must first of all find a means of capturing the enthusiasm of their teachers. Youth exchanges, after what Dr. MacDonald said, I shall pass swiftly over this part, except to say what I think numbers of people in this audience could testify from their own experience, but then when they're well organized, especially if they entail some hospitality in the homes of the country visited, exchanges of that kind widen horizons in a marvelous way and produce lifelong effects. Some of those are activities which only the resources of government, the expertise of non-governmental organizations, and the enthusiasm of individuals brought together will allow to flourish. It all sounds untidy. It is, but all the ingredients are necessary. To return to the list, research about the Commonwealth itself, of which there is hardly any. Scholarships for students, especially the postgraduates, and for postdoctoral fellows and young members of academic staff. None of us ought to be satisfied, as Lord Armstrong was saying to his fellow members of the House of Lords the other night, with a situation in which the Commonwealth's provision of higher education for overseas students is actually declining in relation to that of other states or associations. School linking. For the large majority of younger citizens all over the Commonwealth, there is no hope of travelling to another Commonwealth country. Shall we then merely throw up our hands and say, nothing can be done? Not a bit of it. Links between the schools produce enlightening exchanges of material, ranging from school magazines and individual letters to competitions by post. It's the process which Sir Winston used to call the lighting of new fields of interest in the mind. It costs very little indeed in terms of money and a good deal in time and enthusiasm. Medical collaboration. Here the field is almost illimitable. We should encourage more of the health authorities in this country and the hospitals to strike up partnerships abroad, as our colleagues in the new postgraduate medical school here are doing, as we shall see on the screen in a moment. The scheme under which medical students are enabled to spend an elective period of training abroad is an excellent one. The competition for the places is overwhelming. Far more of them could be funded for quite modest sums. The reports which the medical students return, which chanced to have come my way for a reason I wouldn't otherwise have mentioned, but since Dr. MacDonald has said it, it perhaps bears repetition. In the Lennox Boyd and Edward Boyle Memorial Trusts, we help to fund some of these medical elective periods of training. The reports are truly remarkable. Not only do they show beyond doubt that those who've undertaken that service will be better doctors in their own country when they come back after such an experience, they also show that some have determined, who would not otherwise have decided that, to make a career in the overseas Commonwealth. And the practical help which they've given in field stations and hospitals, generally in conditions beyond our imagination, is beyond price. Now, the senior medical colleagues in universities generally cannot spare 10 months or 12 months for a full year of academic exchange, but they can sometimes manage a few weeks. And here are the slides which have reached us today of the visit with which two of our medical colleagues and Professor Eldred Perry have just been paying. The first slide showed the ruin in which our colleagues in the University of Mbarara, about 200 kilometers from Kampala, in Uganda, are trying to rebuild their lives and run a medical school. Here is the truck, which appeared on that day at least actually to be working. To the right-hand side is Professor Purdy, Dean-elect of our medical school. Here is Professor White, also of the medical school. This is his attempt to show that in these days of adaptation in university life, we must all be prepared for an alternative career. And here is a slide which is entirely irrelevant to the whole of these proceedings, except that it seemed so charming that I couldn't resist putting it on the screen. It is the fact that well-planned visits, even of a few days or weeks, can produce an inspiriting and encouraging effect upon colleagues abroad. I've heard Sir Kenneth Stewart, whose presence was referred to earlier on, say this many times. And we need to acknowledge what is little understood outside the circle of specialists, the parlous state of medical training in some Commonwealth universities, especially in Africa. Collaboration about food, prices, and agriculture. In even this, a huge subject, cannot be a matter for governments alone. On the best predictions offered to us, the shortage of water will bring about in the next 20 years an actual decrease in the agricultural production of the developing world and an increase in or near the developed. I show here slides which demonstrate the incidence of leprosy, graduated in rates per thousand. There, an example of what it can do. And there, the subjects which our colleagues in this university study. There is an example of their raw material as they try to find what has hitherto eluded human grasp, a cure for that disease. Finally, means of turning the Commonwealth's experience to the use of a wider community. For example, can we not extend in the Commonwealth the methods which have been put to good use in the last 5 years in Central and Eastern Europe by the British government under the terms of the Know-How Fund? Amidst so many crying needs, so much more obvious to us every night now on our television screens, is there no room for a Commonwealth volunteer force, much on the lines of the early days of voluntary service overseas? All of which brings me by several routes to the Commonwealth of Learning itself. It is the most imaginative project which the Commonwealth governments have funded in recent years. It was at first intended to be a university, though of a peculiar kind, and then, for a variety of reasons, it became, at any rate for the moment, something different. All the same, Lord Briggs and his colleagues, in their seminal report of 1987, stated as their object that any learner anywhere in the Commonwealth shall be able to study any distance teaching program available from any college or university in the Commonwealth. The conception is simple, bold, and appealing. In less than 5 years of work, the Commonwealth of Learning, as we're able in this university to testify at first hand, has become a valued enabling agency, but not one which simply takes what is available and then distributes it more widely. Part of its purpose is to enable people in one part of the Commonwealth not only to take off the shelf what's already there, but to adapt it or propose new means of using the techniques of communication over long distances. And the Commonwealth of Learning itself has been an active promoter of those techniques.
And turn it into productive knowledge. We already know that for many, education is the key. But the location of educational institutions and the confines of the traditional classroom are making continued access to learning difficult. Do we build more classrooms? Have we enough teachers? Can we afford the cost?
Part of the purpose of the Commonwealth of Learning has, of course, been to bring into contact with each other people with serious interests in that field who would not otherwise have met. To our vast relief, it has not attempted to tell us that it will suffice just to put materials into a package, or that teachers and books are rendered obsolete by the new methods. Rather, Professor Maraj and his colleagues have shown us new paths. For example, the Rajiv Gandhi Fellowships will enable 100 students from 19 Commonwealth countries to obtain master's degrees by distance learning, that to be achieved through the Indira Gandhi National Open University in Delhi. I cite that example simply to indicate that here is something which the Commonwealth is actually doing and which other associations cannot do so well or so readily.
We have trained course developers and provided desktop publishing equipment to help the University of Guyana produce its own learning materials in pre-university English and mathematics. We are sourcing and acquiring other material on the university's behalf, and we have installed a teleconferencing network to link the university with learning centers in major areas of the country. The result? Better prepared students who, even from distant locations, are now able to attend university. We're currently helping extend the reach of India's open universities through distance education. We've helped Indian distance educators share their experiences with Australian colleagues to their mutual benefit. The result? A better understanding among educators and sharpened professional skills.
If there were no other reason to support the Commonwealth of Learning, the fact that it is able to do that, of which of course we've seen only a fragment, that would be sufficient by itself. But the use of these self-standing materials means something of special significance in the poorest countries, because some of their main difficulties can be surmounted. For example, great distances and poor transport, remote and inadequately stocked libraries, out-of-date laboratories.
Recently, we helped Makerere University in Uganda adopt an entire Bachelor of Education program from the University of Nairobi in Kenya. The result? Better teachers, better courses, better students.
In all the poorer countries of the Commonwealth, there is an urgent need not to lag in information technologies. But it isn't only a question of needing expensive equipment, it's even more a need of the training and the people. I hope you'll not mind my saying, Dr. MacDonald, that if the Commonwealth of Learning could introduce into its offering something which will explain the workings of the Commonwealth itself, no doubt its deficiencies as well as its virtues, it would be all to the good that those who are finding new horizons, the casements in the poet's language, of course, open upon the perilous seas. I hope that these are more tranquil, but the windows do open for those who study in that way. And if it could be made possible by you and your colleagues to explain that this advancing knowledge and skill derives from something which the Commonwealth itself is doing, you would be contributing powerfully to the stronger running of those currents without which we must fear for the future. You will see that all this is not simply a plea for vast sums, though it's quite true that to act in a serious way upon some of those suggestions, especially when we remember the huge and growing numbers in the Commonwealth, would cost no negligible amount. But by comparison with the sums freely spent by governments and businesses on other purposes, the price would be modest. Let us concede even so, that part of that price could be valued only by values upon which an accountant cannot put his own price. All these suggestions rather amount to a plea for partnership, for a more humane and actively sympathetic world, for the practical against the grandiose and the organic against the theoretical. We are conscious of a paradox in modern communications. The speed of modern travel makes the miles melt away. The new communications bring us images from all over the world. We console ourselves with talk of the global village and perhaps create cozy notions in our minds of a society of manageable size where genial people have mild disagreements and learn to rub along with each other. But it doesn't seem to be that sort of village which we are inhabiting. Instead, the swiftness of travel and the ease of communication have run far ahead of our sensibilities and structures. When President Bush talked about the New World Order, he was speaking of providing security against aggression, the prime duty of every government. But there's another kind of security, security against famine, disease, corruption, civil war. Even since the hopeful days of only 3 or 4 years ago, the New World Order seems to look more and more like the old world disorder, or perhaps even that description will no longer do because it's a new kind of disorder. And at least in one of its aspects, little noticed so far, the new order is taking on a different character, and one which may have seeds of hope for us, enthusiasts for the Commonwealth, as I hope we are in this hall. Because power in the new world does not reside to the old degree in great agglomerations of people or huge acreages of territory. If that seems an astonishing remark, think of what has happened to Russia, or look at what is happening now inside the European Union, devised 40 years ago to bring together a vast population and massive resources because they were held to be the indispensable bases of strength of any great state. Who on earth would have imagined that governments all over the world would be deliberately divesting themselves of control of what used to be called the commanding heights of the economy? And then there's the involuntary or unconscious shedding of power. Think of what has happened to flows of capital, of attempts to defend currencies at a given value. What has happened to the flow of information? All of it now beyond the control of government. The industrialized nations of the world have about 25% of the population and something near 85% of its income. However we juggle the figures, the message is plain enough. Secondly, more people must have better information about it if the association is to command a heartier allegiance. Thirdly, and to repeat, it must have the support of the intelligent young. Lastly, if we are not prepared to exert ourselves, please let us not blame some inexorable fate, but place the responsibility where it ought to be, on our own lack of will. How to share the resources of the world more equitably, to feed enormously expanded populations, to avoid irreversible biological damage, to secure higher living standards without the ruin of the environment, those are all, by general consent, issues of the first magnitude. And as it chances, they all span the developed as well as the undeveloped world. They matter as much to the one as to the other. And if the Commonwealth could be seen to make a contribution to debate and action on those issues, that alone would justify its existence amply. And can any of us doubt that whether we like it or not, those are questions which will confront us with increased intensity? Just over 90 years ago, that young blood, Mr. Winston Churchill, recently elected to Parliament, gave dinner with a group of his friends to the then Colonial Secretary, Joseph Chamberlain. It was in the spring of 1902, and the government had got into deep parliamentary troubles. The leaders of the party thought that various of the young men had failed to display the needful degree of enthusiasm in their support of the government. Mr. Chamberlain upbraided them. They replied, "How could we possibly support the government when its actions have been so arrogant and inept?" He retorted, "What's the use of supporting the government only when it's right? It's just when we're in this sort of pickle that you should have come to our aid." I mention this episode from the conversation only in case anybody of a fanciful disposition in this audience should think in passing that it has some relevance to our affairs in this country at the moment. To continue, the company heard Mr. Chamberlain at his captivating best. They dined magnificently. Bottles of 1834 port were opened. He stood at the door and said to them, You young gentlemen, you've entertained me royally, and in return I shall give you a priceless secret. Tariffs. They are the politics of the future and the near future. Study them closely, make yourselves masters of them, and you will not regret your hospitality to me. How I wish I could say something so terse and decisive. But education, migration, population, and deprivation are, it seems to me, the politics of the future, not the whole of politics, but an increasing part, and of the near future at that. Racial antagonisms, ancestral hatreds, grinding poverty, preventable disease when the medical skills are there elsewhere in the world, starvation when in other places we're paying to grow food we do not want, and then paying to store food which we do not like to throw away, and then paying to destroy food which we cannot eat. Does not all this strain our consciences to and beyond the limit? How seriously do we intend to concern ourselves with the fates and interests of those who, for the moment, cannot force their concerns upon us in any compelling way? Do we care beyond the shores of mere talk about international collaboration? Do we have a better instrument at our hands than the Commonwealth, with all its admitted imperfections? If so, by all means, let us bid farewell to the one and put our best efforts behind the other. But if not, is not this the time for us to remind ourselves forcefully of the Commonwealth's merits and use all the opportunities which it offers? If you'll allow me to adapt another saying of Burke, we should need for such an enterprise to rear to the most perfect vigor and maturity every generous and honest feeling that belongs to our nature. I well realize that these are not fashionable accents. Perhaps they've faded entirely from our consciousness, in which case, so much the worse for us and far more important for many others. Perhaps what I've tried to say tonight will sound to you merely visionary. But if ever there was an occasion where we should try to raise our sights and minds to more distant horizons, it's an occasion such as this. The Bible says that old men see visions and young men dream dreams. And it's for us, your teachers, to distill from experience what seems most important and valuable, to try to separate the passing from the enduring and the flimsy from the solid. An old saying has it, if only youth had the knowledge and if old age had the strength. The Commonwealth of Learning, to which our renewed thanks, is based upon a mixture of self-help and outside help, upon the proposition that when people of goodwill and talent put their minds to it, they can do something useful for each other, and on the conviction that in our Commonwealth affairs, we must not presume on the past or imagine that a valued association will continue in vigor without sustained effort. To us in this university, it seems plain that the handsome endorsement which the heads of government gave a few months ago in Cyprus to the work of the Commonwealth of Learning should be translated, and that swiftly, into a secure future and an enlarged budget. And that would be a wholly satisfying and deserved tribute to Lord Briggs, who has been so prodigal of his great gifts for so long in the service of so many. I remarked that to make any headway, we need a partnership between governments and businesses and charities and individuals. But we shall make little headway unless we can find a basis for another partnership between the generations. And I see before me in the Middleton Hall tonight young people from the schools of Hull, many of our undergraduates and postgraduates ranging in age from perhaps 18 or 19 to the early 30s. And let me address these final sentences to them. You are entitled, all of you, to draw from us of an older generation knowledge and understanding. All of you, if you so choose, will exercise a considerable influence on your fellows here and in the overseas Commonwealth. Some of you, coming to us as postgraduates, already occupy substantial positions in public life or in the industry, in professions. And within a few years, many more of you will. And if we are to put communications in all their definitions to humane and useful purposes, if the Commonwealth is to be a body which by its example and effort helps the world to grapple with some of these looming problems, That will happen only if you, the younger members of our audience, and your fellows all over the Commonwealth will bring to the cause your energy, your enthusiasm, your generous instincts, and your courage. And it's late in the day, and nothing less will do.
Vice-Chancellor, no one in this room will have any doubt as to the reasons that we were so anxious to have you as our first Commonwealth commemorative lecture for the Commonwealth of Learning. A notable public figure in my own country is known on occasions such as these to say, "I have absolutely nothing to add to what has already been said," and then to spend the next half hour proving it. I shall not fall into that trap beyond saying I want to thank you for, on behalf of all of us in the hall this evening, for this magnificent exposition on the Commonwealth. I want to thank you for your support and endorsement of the Commonwealth of Learning. And I also would like, if I might, to congratulate you and your colleagues in the University of Hull and everyone in this community for the exemplary leadership which this institution has given to the meaning of the Commonwealth, which you so eloquently described through your distance education contribution and through the opportunities which you have made for international students here. I have often said, and I'm so happy to be able to sense and to participate here at first hand, how this institution can stand as a model for what we require and what you have explained. Perhaps because the Commonwealth is unique and so sensible, it does not receive the attention it deserves. But it is, after all, an article of faith. And like any article of faith, we must continue to believe in it, but not only to believe in it, but to ensure that we make it work. And we thank you for the suggestions and the encouragement which you have given to all of us to make sure that we continue to do that. I thank you very much, Vice-Chancellor.